The year is 1945, Bastogne, Belgium. The snow fell in silence, not the gentle silence of a Christmas card, but the terrible, suffocating quiet that comes when men stop screaming. In a frozen foxhole carved from Belgian earth, a young Obergefreiter named Klaus Richter pressed his back against the frozen dirt and tried to remember the last time he'd eaten a full meal. 3 days ago, perhaps 4. Time had become meaningless in the Ardennes. His stomach had long since stopped growling. Now it simply ached, a dull, constant companion more faithful than any comrade. Around him, the remnants of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division huddled in their positions, waiting for supplies that would never come, waiting for ammunition that had been promised by commanders who themselves were starving, waiting, above all, for food. In his frozen fingers, Richter held a prize he had discovered that morning: half a can of American rations, scavenged from a destroyed American position overrun 3 weeks earlier during the initial German offensive. The can was dented, partially rusted, and bore English words he couldn't fully read. But inside were crackers, still intact, and a small tin of processed cheese. To Richter, who had subsisted on watery turnip soup and a single slice of black bread for the past week, this can represented more than sustenance. It represented an impossible truth his commanders had never prepared him to accept. Across the frozen Belgian landscape, less than 8 kilometers to the west, the reality that would shatter the German army's final illusion was taking shape in a spectacle of industrial abundance that defied every principle of war Klaus Richter had been taught. There, in a liberated sector secured by the American 101st Airborne, Technical Sergeant Raymond Mitchell of the 519th Quartermaster Battalion oversaw an operation that would have seemed fantastical to any Wehrmacht officer: the preparation and distribution of hot meals for 80,000 men. Not emergency rations, not survival portions. Hot meals, 3 times a day. The contrast between these two realities, separated by mere kilometers but divided by an unbridgeable chasm of industrial capacity, would come to define not just the Battle of the Bulge, but the entire trajectory of America's contribution to the Second World War. For while battles are remembered for their courage and sacrifice, wars are won by something far less romantic: logistics. And in the science of keeping armies fed, supplied, and fighting, the United States had developed a capability so overwhelming that enemy soldiers, upon witnessing it firsthand, would experience not just defeat, but a fundamental collapse of belief in their own cause. The story of American military logistics in World War II begins not on any battlefield, but in the vast industrial heartland of a nation that, by 1945, had transformed itself into what historians would later call the arsenal of democracy. Before Pearl Harbor, the United States Army ranked 17th in the world in size, smaller than Romania's. Its supply system was antiquated, its procedures manual, its capacity limited. But America possessed something no other combatant nation could match: an industrial base untouched by war, a population experienced in mass production, and a cultural ethos that approached problem-solving with an engineer's mindset rather than a warrior's pride. When America entered the war in December 1941, the challenge was unprecedented. The U.S. Army would grow from 174,000 men to over 8 million within 3 years. These millions would have to be fed, clothed, armed, and sustained across 2 oceans on multiple continents simultaneously. The logistical problems were staggering. A single infantry division required 650 tons of supplies daily. An armored division needed 750 tons. Multiply that across dozens of divisions fighting in North Africa, Italy, France, and the Pacific. Add in air forces consuming fuel by the millions of gallons, and the mathematical reality became clear. America would have to become a logistics superpower or lose the war. The response was characteristically American in its scale and ambition. Between 1942 and 1945, the U.S. Quartermaster Corps, the branch responsible for feeding, clothing, and general supplying of troops, grew from 14,000 personnel to over 280,000. They, established a supply chain that stretched from factories in Detroit and Chicago to warehouses in England and Australia, from ports in California to forward depots in the Philippine jungles. At its peak, this system moved 17 million tons of supplies across the Atlantic annually, and another 8 million tons across the Pacific. It was, in the words of British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, who was rarely generous with compliments toward Americans, the most extraordinary achievement in military history. But numbers alone fail to capture what made American logistics revolutionary. It wasn't just quantity, it was philosophy. While the Wehrmacht operated on the principle of Auftragstaktik, mission-type orders emphasizing initiative and improvisation, their supply system remained rigid, hierarchical, and dependent on horse-drawn wagons and railways. The German army in 1945 still relied on over 600,000 horses for transport. Their supply depots operated on requisition systems that required weeks of paperwork. A German division surrounded or cut off from supply lines was expected to live off the land, a euphemism for starvation and failure. The American system embraced standardization, mechanization, and redundancy. Every item, from bullets to bandages, was cataloged in a master system with its own stock number. Supplies moved forward in continuous streams, not intermittent shipments. Most revolutionary of all was the American approach to forward supply. Rather than waiting for units to request specific items, supply units pushed standardized loads forward based on statistical consumption models. If experience showed an infantry company in heavy combat consumed 40 K rations and 1,200 rounds of rifle ammunition daily, those supplies flowed forward automatically. Commanders didn't beg for resources. They managed abundance. This abundance found its most visible expression in food. The American military, learning from the malnutrition problems that plagued the Army during World War I, had made nutrition a science. The Quartermaster Corps employed dietitians, food chemists, and even psychologists who studied what food soldiers preferred under combat stress. The result was a ration system unmatched by any army in history. The basic K ration, designed for combat troops in forward positions, contained not just calories, but balanced nutrition: canned meat, biscuits, chocolate, fruit bars, cigarettes, and even chewing gum. Each K ration provided 3,000 calories and included powdered coffee, sugar, and salt tablets. German soldiers, upon capturing American positions, were stunned to discover that what Americans considered emergency rations exceeded what Wehrmacht troops received in garrison. But K rations were merely the emergency option. Whenever possible, and American logistics made possible what other armies considered impossible, troops received hot meals prepared by mobile field kitchens. These meals weren't survival fare. They were real food: roast beef, potatoes, vegetables, bread, butter, coffee, and dessert. On Thanksgiving 1944, while fighting raged across France and the Pacific, the U.S. Army served turkey dinner with all the trimmings to over 3 million men in combat zones. This wasn't propaganda. It was policy. American military planners understood what German generals never grasped. Well-fed soldiers fight better, longer, and with higher morale. Food wasn't just fuel, it was a weapon. The true test of this system came during the winter of 1944-45, when the Wehrmacht launched its final desperate gamble, Operation Wacht am Rhein, known to history as the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler's plan was audacious: smash through the weakly defended Ardennes, capture the vital port of Antwerp, split the Allied armies, and force a negotiated peace in the West. The attack achieved complete surprise. German forces, secretly concentrated in the Schnee-Eifel forests, struck on December 16th with 200,000 men and 600 tanks. American lines buckled, then broke. Within 3 days, German spearheads had penetrated 60 miles, creating a bulge in the Allied front that gave the battle its name. But from the beginning, the German offensive carried within it the seeds of its own failure, and those seeds were logistical. The Wehrmacht attacked with minimal supplies, gambling that they could capture American fuel and supply dumps before their own stocks ran out. It was a desperate plan born of desperate circumstances. By December 1944, Germany's war economy was collapsing. Allied bombing had devastated fuel production. The Luftwaffe grounded most aircraft simply for lack of aviation gasoline. German tank units began the offensive with perhaps 40% of the fuel needed to reach Antwerp. They would have to capture American supplies or die trying. This plan met reality on the snow-covered roads of Belgium. While German tanks advanced, their supply columns, still heavily dependent on horses and already depleted by 3 years of Eastern Front attrition, struggled through winter conditions with inadequate transport. Meanwhile, behind the American lines, a logistics miracle was unfolding. When news of the German breakthrough reached Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, (SHEF), the response wasn't panic, but systematic adjustment. The supply system that normally pushed resources forward to advancing troops simply reversed direction, creating defensive supply lines with the same efficiency. Within 48 hours of the German attack, Quartermaster units had established supply dumps around Bastogne, the critical crossroads town that would become the battle's focal point. When the 101st Airborne Division was ordered to Bastogne on December 18th, they arrived to find supply dumps already prepared with ammunition, fuel, medical supplies, and food. The paratroopers of the 101st, veterans of Normandy and Operation Market Garden, had fought in desperate circumstances before. But as they dug in around Bastogne and German forces surrounded them on December 21st, they understood something their enemy did not. They would not starve. The encirclement of Bastogne lasted 8 days. During that week, as German forces hammered the perimeter and winter storms grounded all aircraft, the 101st's supplies dwindled. Ammunition rationing became strict. Medical supplies ran low. But the men continued to eat. Quartermaster personnel, as much soldiers as the riflemen in the foxholes, carefully managed food stocks, ensuring every man received at least one hot meal daily when conditions permitted, and K-rations when they didn't. Even on December 22nd, when German commanders delivered their famous ultimatum demanding surrender, the American response, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe's legendary one-word reply, "Nuts, Audedun," was delivered by men who, while short on ammunition, had not missed a meal. Outside the encirclement, the American supply system performed what German officers would later describe as impossible. General Patton's Third Army, operating southeast of the Bulge, received orders on December 19th to disengage from its current offensive, rotate 90 degrees north, and counterattack into the German flank to relieve Bastogne. This meant redirecting an entire army group, over 250,000 men with thousands of vehicles, across winter roads through the Ardennes. Military theorists of the era estimated such a maneuver would require 2 weeks minimum. Patton promised to attack in 3 days. The logistics of Patton's redeployment reveal the American system at its peak. Hundreds of trucks from the Quartermaster Corps' Red Ball Express, the rapid supply convoy system that had sustained the advance across France, were redirected to support Third Army. Fuel dumps were relocated. Supply priority shifted. And critically, food supplies moved with the combat units. When Third Army's 4th Armored Division smashed through German lines to reach Bastogne on December 26th, their first action upon entering the town wasn't tactical. It was logistical. Supply trucks followed immediately behind the lead tanks, bringing ammunition, fuel, and rations. The 101st Airborne, which had held for 8 days while surrounded, received hot coffee and donuts from Red Cross units within hours of relief. This wasn't propaganda. It was filmed and photographed. German prisoners marched past these scenes, stared in incomprehension. For the German soldiers experiencing this plenty firsthand, the psychological impact was devastating. Klaus Richter, the Obergefreiter in his frozen foxhole clutching a scavenged can of American rations, represented millions of Wehrmacht soldiers confronting a reality their propaganda had never prepared them to face. German media had spent years portraying Americans as soft, decadent, lacking the martial spirit and sacrificial will of the German soldier. American wealth was dismissed as vulgar materialism, that would crumble under the test of true warfare. When German soldiers finally encountered American forces in large numbers, they expected to find pampered weaklings who would break under pressure. Instead, they found abundance. Not just material abundance, but an abundance of will, organization, and systematic competence. In the accounts of German prisoners, thousands of interviews conducted by U.S. Army intelligence during and after the war, a consistent theme emerges: shock at American logistics. One German officer, captured during the Bulge, stated in his interrogation, "We were told you were poorly supplied, and your soldiers were demoralized. Then I saw supply trucks delivering hot food to frontline positions while my men had not eaten in 2 days. I knew then we could not win." This psychological dimension of logistics extended beyond mere material comfort. It represented a fundamental ideological challenge to everything Nazi propaganda had taught. The German soldier had been raised on narratives of Germanic superiority, of strength through sacrifice, of winning through superior will and racial destiny. American abundance suggested a different formula: strength through organization, victory through industrial capacity, superiority not of blood, but of systems. For soldiers who had endured years of increasing deprivation, shorter rations, threadbare uniforms, deteriorating equipment, the encounter with American plenty was cognitively dissonant. How could a decadent democracy outproduce, outfight, and outlast a nation supposedly purified by hardship? The answer lay in the very things Nazi ideology rejected: democratic capitalism, individual initiative channeled through collective systems, and pragmatic problem-solving unbound by racial ideology. The American logistics system worked not despite democratic values, but because of them. Quartermaster sergeants made decisions colonels would make in the Wehrmacht. Black soldiers in the Red Ball Express drove trucks as capably as white soldiers, undermining Nazi racial theories with every delivery. Women in factories produced the weapons and supplies, demonstrating that total war required total participation, not fascist gender hierarchy. The American way of war was, fundamentally, a democratic way of war, and its success challenged every fascist assumption. Perhaps nowhere was this contrast more visible than in the treatment of prisoners. When German soldiers surrendered to American forces, they expected, at minimum, harsh treatment. Many had been told stories, false but believed, that Americans executed prisoners or starved them. Instead, they entered a POW system that, while certainly not luxurious, provided regular meals that exceeded what Wehrmacht troops in the field received. By 1945, German soldiers were surrendering in droves not just to escape battle, but to eat. Intelligence reports documented cases of entire Wehrmacht units deliberately seeking American lines to surrender after days without food. One prisoner, interviewed in March 1945, stated, "I fought for 3 years in Russia and 2 years in the West. I never saw food like this until I became a prisoner." This was not merely anecdotal. The U.S. Army's own records document the food provided to POWs. In accordance with the Geneva Convention, prisoners received rations equivalent to garrison troops, approximately 3,500 calories daily, including meat, bread, vegetables, and even occasional desserts. POW camps in the United States served meals that would have been considered excellent by civilian standards in rationed wartime Europe. A camp in Texas recorded its menu for 1 week in February 1945. Beef stew, pork chops, roast chicken, spaghetti with meat sauce, fresh bread, butter, coffee, and fruit. Meanwhile, in Germany, civilian rations had fallen to 1,200 calories daily, and Wehrmacht troops in the field often received less. The irony was bitter. German soldiers ate better as American prisoners than as German defenders of the Reich. The scale of the American logistics achievement becomes even more staggering when examined in specific numbers. The 519th Quartermaster Battalion, mentioned at this narrative's opening, was just one of hundreds of such units. Yet its daily operations reveal the systematic nature of American supply. In January 1945, during the height of the Bulge fighting, the 519th operated 4 mobile field kitchens and 2 bakery units serving approximately 80,000 men daily. Each kitchen, mounted on trucks and capable of moving with advancing troops, could prepare 3,000 hot meals per day. The bakery units produced 20,000 pounds of fresh bread daily. This wasn't rear area garrison feeding. This was food prepared within artillery range of German positions. The system feeding these kitchens stretched back through a logistics chain of staggering complexity. Bread flour came from mills in Kansas and Nebraska, shipped by rail to East Coast ports, transported by convoy across the U-boat-infested Atlantic to England, then channeled through Antwerp's docks, once captured, to forward supply depots in Belgium. Meat came from beef and pork producers across America's Midwest, processed in Chicago's stockyards, canned in Iowa factories, and followed the same global journey. Coffee beans from South America, chocolate from American manufacturers, powdered milk from dairy farms, canned fruit from California, all flowed through a supply pipeline managed by thousands of logistics, personnel using systems that presaged modern just-in-time delivery. This system fed not just 80,000 men but millions. By January 1945, the U.S. Army had 3.5 million men in the European theater of operations. Simultaneously, another 1.8 million served in the Pacific. Each day, the Quartermaster Corps provided approximately 20 million pounds of food to these forces worldwide. In 1 year, American forces consumed over 3 billion pounds of meat, 2 billion pounds of bread, 600 million pounds of coffee, and 500 million pounds of chocolate. For context, this was enough to provide every American soldier with 3 full meals daily, over 4,000 calories, for the entire war. In the end, the story of American logistics in World War II transcends accounting and supply tables. It represents a profound statement about how nations mobilize power and what that power represents. Klaus Richter, the German soldier in his frozen foxhole clutching a can of American rations, glimpsed a truth his propaganda had hidden. The contest wasn't between German will and American softness, but between two fundamentally different systems. One system based on sacrifice, hierarchy, and the myth of superiority through suffering demanded everything from its people and delivered less and less. The other system, based on organization, pragmatism, and the harnessing of abundance, provided for its defenders with a completeness that transformed soldiers into confident victors. The can of rations in Richter's hands, dented, partial, scavenged from a weeks-old battlefield, represented more than food. It represented the central irony of the war. The side that glorified sacrifice starved, while the side that valued abundance fed even its enemies. When American forces eventually overran Richter's position in late January 1945, he surrendered without firing a shot, stepping from his foxhole with hands raised and hoped that his captors would give him more of what that can had contained. They did. Within hours of surrender, Richter received his first hot meal in months: beef stew, bread, coffee. He ate it in a prisoner collection point while American supply trucks drove past in continuous streams, carrying forward the supplies that would finish the war. That image, the defeated enemy eating American rations while American supplies moved forward in abundance, captures the fundamental truth of how the war was won. Courage mattered, tactics mattered, technology mattered, but beneath all of it, the irreducible foundation of victory was the logistical capacity to keep armies supplied, fed, and fighting until the enemy's ability to resist collapsed. The United States, blessed by geography, enriched by immigration, empowered by democratic institutions, and industrialized to an unprecedented degree, possessed that capacity in measures no other nation could match. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't heroic in the traditional sense, but it was decisive. In the vast cemeteries of Europe and the Pacific, where hundreds of thousands of American dead lie buried, the logistics they relied upon rests buried too, honored in memory if not in monuments. The quartermaster sergeant who ensured supplies reached forward positions, the truck driver who navigated frozen roads under artillery fire, the baker who produced bread within miles of the front, the statistician who calculated consumption rates in a quiet office. These too were warriors. They won the war not by killing enemies, but by sustaining friends. They proved that in modern warfare the phrase, "an army marches on its stomach," had evolved into something more profound. An army wins on its supply chain. When Technical Sergeant Raymond Mitchell of the 519th Quartermaster Battalion retired after the war, he kept a single memento from his service: a battered metal coffee pot from one of his mobile field kitchens. That pot had brewed coffee for thousands of soldiers in Belgium, Germany, and finally in occupation duty. In his later years, when asked about the war, Mitchell didn't speak of battles or bravery. He spoke of systems, of organization, of the satisfaction of knowing that hungry men were fed. "We won," he said in an oral history interview years later, "because we decided to win, and then we worked the problem. Every day we worked the problem. Feed the men, keep them supplied, do your job, and eventually the other side runs out of everything and you haven't. That's how you win a war." It was an engineer's answer, a quartermaster's philosophy, and ultimately a democratic nation's truth. The United States won World War II not because Americans were inherently superior, but because American systems were. Those systems, flexible, abundant, responsive, and remarkably efficient, transformed national wealth into military power, with a completeness that stunned enemies and allies alike. The can of rations that Klaus Richter held in his frozen fingers was more than food. It was a message written in processed cheese and crackers, a message that crossed ideological boundaries and penetrated propaganda. In the contest between tyranny and democracy, the free society possessed not just moral superiority, but practical supremacy. It could organize, it could produce, it could deliver, and in war, as in peace, those who can deliver abundance ultimately prevail over those who can only demand sacrifice. The snow continued to fall on Belgium that January, covering the frozen foxholes and the dead, the abandoned tanks and the destroyed villages. But beneath the snow, a new order was being written by supply sergeants and truck drivers, by statisticians and quartermasters, by all the unglamorous architects of victory. They were writing it not in blood or rhetoric, but in tons delivered, calories consumed, and soldiers sustained. It was the arithmetic of abundance, the calculus of logistics, the quiet mathematics of war. And in that arithmetic, America had found the formula for victory. Feed your soldiers, supply your armies, outproduce your enemies, and sustain the fight until those who glorify sacrifice finally exhaust themselves against those who master supply. That lesson, learned at enormous cost across 6 years of global war, echoes still. Wars are not won by those who sacrifice most beautifully, but by those who organize most effectively. Freedom's defense requires not just courage, but capability. And the greatest capability a free society possesses is its ability to harness abundance not for luxury, but for purpose. To feed the defenders of liberty with such overwhelming completeness that even enemies, tasting that plenty, glimpse the truth of what they fight against. That truth, more than any bullet or bomb, wins wars and shapes the peace that follows. In the end, democracy's ultimate weapon wasn't the atomic bomb. It was the can of rations, the cup of hot coffee, the slice of fresh bread. It was the promise kept to every soldier: "We will not abandon you. We will not let you starve. We will sustain you until victory." That promise, fulfilled by quartermasters in quiet competence, proved more powerful than any dictator's rhetoric, and in that promise fulfilled lay the seed of victory. Contrast this with Germany's situation. By late 1944, the Wehrmacht's food supply had collapsed into crisis. Official rations for frontline troops in January 1945 specified 3,000 calories daily, but actual distribution rarely exceeded 2,000 calories, often less. A typical German soldier's daily ration consisted of a pound of bread, often partially sawdust adulterated by this stage, a small amount of processed meat or cheese, margarine, and ersatz coffee made from roasted grain. Fresh vegetables were rare. Meat that wasn't processed was almost non-existent. The German logistics system, strained by years of war on multiple fronts and devastated by Allied bombing, simply couldn't deliver. German units in the field routinely operated on half rations, or less, with predictable effects on combat effectiveness. The Japanese situation was even worse. By 1945, American submarine warfare and air attacks had effectively severed Japanese supply lines. Japanese soldiers in the Pacific, cut off on island garrisons and in the jungles of Burma and China, starved in horrific numbers. Post-war analysis revealed that more Japanese soldiers died from malnutrition and starvation-related disease than from combat. The Imperial Japanese Army, which had begun the war with logistical inadequacies, Japanese military planning notoriously undervalued logistics, ended it with troops literally eating bark, roots, and in extreme cases, resorting to cannibalism. When Japanese soldiers encountered American supply dumps after brief tactical victories, they found abundance that seemed to mock their own nation's deprivation. Chocolate bars, canned fruit, white rice, meat, items Japanese civilians hadn't seen in years. The symbolic power of this abundance extended beyond immediate military advantage. It became, in itself, a form of psychological warfare. American commanders understood this and used it deliberately. After major battles, when German or Japanese prisoners were processed, American forces often ensured POWs witnessed supply operations, trucks unloading food, field kitchens preparing meals, supply dumps stacked with crates. This wasn't cruelty. It was strategic communication. The message was clear: you cannot win. We have resources without limit. Resistance is futile. This message penetrated. In the final months of the European War, as German forces retreated toward the Reich, Wehrmacht cohesion began to collapse. While elite SS units and fanatical Hitler Youth fought with desperate intensity, ordinary Wehrmacht soldiers increasingly chose surrender. American intelligence reports from March and April 1945 document entire companies surrendering without fight, often sending forward representatives to negotiate terms. In many cases, the negotiation wasn't about safety, but about food. Units would surrender if guaranteed immediate rations. The proud Wehrmacht, which had conquered Europe from France to the gates of Moscow, was ending the war bartering for meals. The American logistics system's crowning achievement came in the war's final month, during the rapid advance into Germany. As Allied forces crossed the Rhine and drove into Germany's heartland, they encountered not just military resistance, but humanitarian catastrophe. Years of Allied bombing, Nazi economic mismanagement, and the chaos of military collapse had created widespread civilian starvation. German cities, their distribution systems destroyed, faced famine. Additionally, Allied forces discovered concentration camps and forced labor camps containing hundreds of thousands of victims in advanced states of starvation. The same logistics system that fed armies now faced an unprecedented challenge: feeding millions of civilians and liberated prisoners in a country where normal distribution had ceased to exist. The response demonstrated the system's flexibility. Quartermaster units, working with military government personnel, established civilian feeding stations in occupied German cities. Bakeries that had supplied frontline troops now baked bread for German civilians. Supply convoys delivered rations to displaced persons camps housing liberated concentration camp survivors. It was a staggering undertaking, complicated by damage to infrastructure and ongoing military operations. Yet by May 1945, U.S. forces were feeding approximately 8 million German civilians daily in occupied zones, in addition to their own 3 million troops. When British and French zones are included, Allied logistics sustained over 15 million civilians that first summer after German surrender. This humanitarian operation, born of logistical capacity, had profound political implications. For Germans, civilians, the experience of American occupation was defined not by vengeance, though occupation was certainly not gentle, but by order and food. Within weeks of surrender, Germans in American zones were receiving regular rations. Starvation, which had seemed imminent in April, receded. American military government, backed by quartermaster efficiency, provided stability. This experience shaped German attitudes in ways political speeches never could. When the question of Germany's future alignment arose, when the Cold War began to split Europe, the citizens of Western Germany remembered who had fed them. The Marshall Plan, beginning in 1948, built upon foundations laid by Army quartermasters in 1945. In the Pacific, the story followed a similar arc. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the nation faced starvation. Years of war had devastated Japanese agriculture. The merchant fleet, which normally imported food, lay at the bottom of the Pacific. Rice stocks were nearly exhausted. Famine threatened, with estimates suggesting millions might die in the winter of 1945–46. The American occupation, under General Douglas MacArthur, faced the same challenge as in Germany: feed a defeated enemy, population to prevent humanitarian catastrophe, and create stability for occupation policy. Once again, American logistics rose to the occasion. Within weeks of landing occupation forces, U.S. Army quartermasters established food distribution systems across Japan. American supplies, rice from California, wheat from Kansas, canned goods, from factories across America, flowed into Japanese ports and then to distribution centers nationwide. By December 1945, American occupation authorities were feeding over 4 million Japanese civilians daily through direct food aid, with millions more receiving rations through revived Japanese distribution systems backed by American supplies. Starvation was averted. As in Germany, this act of logistical competence translated into political legitimacy. Japanese civilians who had been taught to fear American occupation as brutal and vengeful instead experienced efficiency and, if not generosity, at least sufficiency. The lessons learned from this vast logistics enterprise shaped everything that followed. The American military, having proven that wars are won as much by supply sergeants as by infantry riflemen, institutionalized logistics as a core competency. The systems developed during World War II became the foundation for American military power throughout the Cold War and beyond. The military's logistics doctrine, prepositioned supplies, redundant supply chains, statistical consumption models, and the primacy of keeping forces fed, fueled, and armed became articles of faith. When American forces deployed to Korea in 1950, to Vietnam in the 1960s, to the Persian Gulf in 1991, and to Iraq and Afghanistan after 2001, they carried with them a logistics capability rooted in World War II innovations. Beyond the military, American logistics experience transformed civilian commerce. The systems designed to move supplies across oceans and continents influenced post-war container shipping, modern supply chain management, and the just-in-time manufacturing that defines global commerce. The men who managed quartermaster operations became business leaders in post-war America, bringing military logistics efficiency to civilian enterprise. The same mindset that ensured hot meals reached Bastogne evolved into the systems that ensure consumer goods reach stores worldwide. The American way of war became, in many ways, the American way of commerce. But perhaps the deepest legacy was ideological. The success of American logistics in World War II represented a vindication of democratic industrial capitalism, at a moment when that system faced existential challenges from both fascism and communism. Against fascist claims that democracies were weak and decadent, America demonstrated that free societies could organize, produce, and fight with overwhelming effectiveness. Against communist claims that capitalism was inherently chaotic and inefficient, America proved that market economies, when mobilized for common purpose, could outproduce command economies by staggering margins. The American soldier, well-fed and well-supplied, became a walking advertisement for the democratic capitalist system. German and Japanese soldiers, confronting this reality in defeat, carried those lessons forward. In post-war Germany and Japan, as both nations rebuilt under American influence, the memory of American abundance shaped economic and political choices. The economic miracles of both countries, Germany's Wirtschaftswunder and Japan's post-war boom, were built on market-oriented systems influenced by American models. The same nations that had believed in autarky and martial sacrifice embraced international trade and consumer abundance. Former enemies became allies not just through political treaties, but through shared economic integration into an American-led global system.